So I just finished reading The Ruins by Scott Smith, and I picked it up because I'm currently writing a horror novel, and I want to just be more aware of what has already been written in the horror space. And I'm fascinated by the question of what is the scariest book that's ever been written? Horror is very subjective, but there are some books that will pop up in these kinds of lists pretty often. The Ruins is one of those. It wasn't always at the top of the list, but it was often in the conversation. So I was interested in the plot and the story, character development, but I was more looking at it just from a mechanical sense. How does he deliver a scare? I've watched many horror movies and I've read quite a few horror novels, but it's a different medium, and the way that you build tension and suspense and deliver a scare is going to be very different in the written word than in a film. The other part of my brain was just trying to survive this novel because it wasn't fun. It was awful, but I liked it. It's hard to explain. So just a basic overview of what the book is about. It follows two American couples on a trip to Mexico. They meet a few people along the way while they're vacationing, and they very quickly find themselves stranded on this strange hill at the site of these ancient ruins where some archaeologists had been investigating these ruins. And things go very, very poorly from there. The entire thing takes place in a very small space. I'm not going to be talking about the story too much, but there are some spoiler-related things that I will be discussing, so that's just a warning. The first technique that I want to mention is something that I'm thinking of as a Rubik's Cube approach to horror. This analogy might not work for everyone, but I imagined Scott Smith having a Rubik's Cube with all of these different colors of horror. There's physical threats that he creates in the environment. There's psychological fears that these characters have. And throughout the course of the book, he's turning this sort of Rubik's Cube. He'll take a physical pain or a physical need and contrast it or compare it with something more mental, something more at the heart of the character. There's a specific scene where he does this with the character of Amy. She wakes up in the middle of the night in this tent. She is almost literally dying of thirst. But all of the characters have already had their rationed amount of water for the day. They don't have much water. They can only have a few sips a day. But she wakes up in the night. She sees the water jug across the tent from her. And Smith spends pages of her just battling with herself on whether or not she takes a sip and satisfies that physical need to have a drink with the fear that she has of not conforming to the needs of the group. She worries what they're going to think of her, if they're going to think that she's betrayed them in some way if she does this. And in a more unskilled author's hand, that could get really boring or really monotonous. But it works really, really well because it's believable. It seems like the kind of thing that somebody would actually be struggling with in themselves, where your body is telling you one thing, but you love your friends and you don't want to disadvantage them in some way. And this happens throughout the novel. There's one fear that is pitted against another fear, or a fear that will feed into another fear, and they form this kind of parasitic relationship with the character. What you ultimately get is something that is very three-dimensional. It's not a flat, shallow view of a fear. It's something that feels like it has weight. And ultimately, this leads to a novel that is much more scary on a fundamental level than some other books I've read. Another thing that Scott Smith uses to create fear is he develops this sense of inevitability. This one is a little bit harder for me to pin down, but it's the best word that I can use to describe what I felt throughout reading it. All of this seems inevitable. Again, spoiler alert, everybody dies in this book. Not only the main characters, but the characters who came before them. And in the last couple pages of the book, we realize the characters who are coming after them are going to die as well. And I feel like critics of horror would hear that and be like, well, of course they did. What did you expect? And it's this weird thing where Scott Smith is able to do multiple things at once. He does create this feeling of inevitability. Like, you know from the beginning that this is not going to go well for these characters. They're not meant to survive this situation. You have one character who is a former Eagle Scout, and he does his best with the survival skills that he's trying to draw upon to stretch out their survival as long as possible. But ultimately, he doesn't accomplish much. I think that in the hands of another author, this book would have played more like an adventure story. Like, how do they get out of this scenario? How can they put their heads together to problem solve and survive? And that would have been maybe a great version of this book, but it didn't seem to be what Scott Smith was trying to write. He seemed to be writing about the idea of death being something that is inevitable, something that we all have to face and wrestle with at some point, and the fear that comes from having to wrestle with that sooner than you would have wanted to. All of these characters are in their 20s or 30s, and they're suddenly thrust into this situation where they have to think whether or not they're going to survive the next day, whether their friends or their loved ones are going to survive the next day. And where all horror in some sense is about death, a lot of horror is more about the mechanics of it. Wouldn't it be scary to die in this way from this thing, this being, this person? And there's elements of that here, but the book is more about confronting death as a whole. And each of the characters does that in their own way. Some of them spend much of the book denying that it's going to happen. They convince themselves that rescue is coming. Some of the characters come to terms with it, but in a much more silent, subdued kind of a way. And it's a credit to Scott Smith's ability that he creates this sense of inevitability without you predicting exactly how it's going to go and closing the book, because what's the point anyway? For me, I felt like there was something really true and honest about the ways that each of these characters faced death and suffering that made it feel worthwhile, as much of a downer as it is in the end. The third technique that I think Scott Smith uses really well to create horror is he presents time as an enemy to the characters. This, again, isn't something particularly new to horror, but the way that he does it is very effective. The book takes place over a very short period of time, just a few days and nights, where the characters are trapped on this hill. But there's this odd, sort of hypnotic, warped timing to everything that's quite scary, because you have characters who are dreading the daytime when the sun is beating down on them. They're thirsty and they're sweating, but the night has its own sort of horrors that they want to postpone as long as possible. And you get this sense that the characters are starting to lose a grasp on time as well. The sun seems to beat down on them from the same place for hours and hours and hours, and before they know it, it's setting, long before they've had time to collect food or water. And so you get this mix of feeling like the characters are running out of time, and yet time is stretched out in these long, excruciating, hot hours under the sun. There's an interesting sort of touch point that gets brought into the book, I think around halfway through, where one of the characters is rummaging through this backpack, and he comes across a copy of The Sun Also Rises by Ernest Hemingway. He picks it up for a second and tosses it aside and moves on. And I assume if it's in the book, we're meant to draw a comparison between the two. I read The Sun Also Rises a couple years ago, and I really, really liked it, but not until I'd finished it and spent some time thinking about it. There are some similarities to The Ruins, not in terms of genre at all, but just that you are spending this time with a group of people who are on vacation for an extended period of time, and they're kind of insufferable in a lot of ways. There's jealousy, and there's affairs, and there's anger that brews over into violence. And it's a really difficult read in some ways. It's one that I really wanted to be done with. But the way that Hemingway presents these characters, and just this sense of time being stretched and compressed, it gave the story a sort of reality that I don't often experience with books. It was to the point that I cared more about what happened to these insufferable, awful characters than characters that I enjoy reading about in other books. It's a weird thing. Another small interesting thing I noticed is the Bible verse that The Sun Also Rises is referencing, which is Ecclesiastes 1:5, also applies to a lot of what happens in The Ruins. The sun also ariseth, and the sun goeth down, and hasteth to his place where he arose. And I found it interesting where that verse, and really that whole passage that it sits within, has a lot of metaphorical significance, but also in a literal sense to The Ruins. All of the characters are grappling with this slow march of time, the sun rising and the sun going down, and their suffering and their pain, the monotony of their existence never coming to an end. And I think the way that Hemingway grapples with that experience and the way that Scott Smith grapples with it is very different, and they're coming at it from different angles, but there are some very interesting similarities, and it makes me want to go back and read The Sun Also Rises again just to pull out some of those comparisons. So those are some takeaways from The Ruins. I found this a fun exercise of reading a book for the enjoyment. It's a hard book to say that I enjoyed, but reading it for the sake of reading it, and also trying to really pick it apart from a technical sense and understanding some of the ingredients behind what makes something scary. There are some other horror novels I'm planning on getting to soon, so I may do something similar with them and try to pick them apart. If you come across this video and you have a strong opinion on what the scariest novel of all time is, feel free to let me know and maybe I'll give it a read. Anyhow, thanks for watching.